I believe things happen when they're supposed to happen. Try that with me. Just try it. Come on, come on, come on, come on. Ooh, music. Snippets. I gotta breathe, right? Am I gonna spontaneously combust when this thing hits zero? Because I feel on the edge a little bit. Snippets, because all of our narratives are infinitely nuanced. And we're all creating ourselves every day and making amazing works of art. We're going to start my story in the 6th grade, right? 1971, I think. 1961. Ooh. 11 years old. This is the year that I helplessly witnessed my mother get carried out of the house in a straitjacket. And I was in a parochial school, 40 kids in a class. And in 1961, you didn't really talk about your mother being in a mental institution, right? She was a nut. Okay, so you didn't talk about it. You didn't share. You didn't have that opportunity to identify with people, to help heal. So I would go to school very angry, and I was extremely disruptive. And on one given day, the nun, who used to whack me around a little bit, lock me in closets, was walking down the corridor, and she had a book. And in that book, there was a little drawing of an elf, and she's walking, not the corridor, she's walking down the aisles, and she's going by to everybody saying, I would like these enlarged so I can decorate the blackboard. Remember that? And she walked by me. I don't know how I managed to get adults to act this way, right? She walked by me and said, you wouldn't be interested, and walked past me. Or maybe she was really smart. And I said, whoa, wait a minute. I can do that. Took it home, and I worked all night. I must have done 30 versions until they were perfect, because I wasn't going to fail, because this was a challenge, right? From that point on, she continued to distract me from being distracting by giving me art projects. And she also exposed me to music. Remember that. That's the seed. So now let's go to 1969. I had recently dropped out of college. My mid-semester cumulative index was 0.16. I had a D in logic, a class being taught by the math department. I was a math major for a minute, right? Good at fractions, 0.16, right? And I had all Fs. I was busy. I was busy evading the draft as best as I could. I was busy taking and dealing drugs, and I was busy gambling. So it wasn't as if I was unoccupied, okay? Well, in 1969, as a result, heroin started to come into our clique. You know, it was all fun and games when we were doing acid and methamphetamine and we were smoking pot. But when heroin came in, not that those are great things, but when heroin came into the scene, it started to get very scary, and the whole scene started to change. And I got scared because I really wasn't that tough, you know. And I voluntarily enrolled myself in a drug rehab program. It was an outreach program that was run by recovering addicts who had come from a residential facility, and this was sort of second stage for them to run this coffee house. But they also had a program embedded in the coffee house. And now one day, we're having an encounter group, and one of these recovering addicts says to me, so what do you do other than being a wise guy, which you're not terribly good at? And let's go back to 1961. I said I was an artist. I hadn't made art, but that seed had been planted in my head. And they said, well, why don't you go to the art store, buy some art supplies, and why don't you be an artist? And I remember that moment with the similar level of anxiety that I'm feeling right now. I walked into that store, and I had no idea what to do. There was all these amazing materials. I had no idea what to buy. I was completely anxious. I was afraid to ask because I didn't want to reveal my ignorance, and I left. And there was a renowned school design student who had an alcohol problem who was also involved in the program, And I told her about my experience, and she took me to the art store, and she got me started. She also took me to the Rizzi Museum for the first time in my life. Amazing treasures. And I became obsessed. That's me in New York City with a Pall Mall cigarette from Junior Collins, who played on the Umberto the Cool album. First time I'd ever been to New York City, and our coffee house was one of 6 coffee houses selected in the country to get an award, and we were called the Rubicon, Julius Caesar's famous crossing. So a few years later, I'm married. I have a house in the suburbs. I have an artist. I'm making art profusely. I'm studying about different artists' lives and everything. And I'm starting to cross circles with different kinds of artists, with writers, with musicians, all of these kinds of things. I started trading artwork to learn how to play the flute and all of these kinds of things. And one of those people was a writer. And he used to come to my house, and he used to bring a bottle of scotch, and we would go up in my studio, and then about halfway through the bottle of scotch, we would be arguing about the origins of the universe, whatever. And on one given day, we're drinking, and we're quite intoxicated, and he looks at me. Remember, I was an amateur wise guy once. He looks across the table from me, and he says, you know, you're an intelligent guy, I think, but you're ignorant. Not the kind of thing you say to a person who's drank a half a bottle of scotch and was an amateur wise guy, right? So I said, you need to explain yourself. And he said, you need to read some books. I said, really? Why don't you make a list? And what was on that list? Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Camus' Myth of Sisyphus, Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, all of Yeats's poetry, James Joyce's Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, and on, and I ate it up. I actually had this moment where, how come nobody told me about this? Maybe if they gave me a copy of Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov and then locked me in the closet, we could have got somewhere. And I became obsessive. And what did I discover? That most of these people, or many of them, had at one point or another been communing on the left bank of the Seine. So I took my 2-week vacation from my straight job and went there with my wife and stayed at the Hotel de Vieux Paris on the left bank of the Seine. Right? Where Camus and Verlaine and Rimbaud and Rodin and Gertrude Stein and all of these people had coffee in the same damn cafe I'm having coffee in. And then after one of these days of going around and seeing museums and doing all of this great stuff, we come back to the room, and I'm in the room, and I hear music. And I look out the window, and there's a building right near the building. And through that window, I see another window, and there's blinds that are slightly open. And I can barely see a piano, and I can see dancers. And they're playing this music. It was probably one of the most tragic moments of my life, because I collapsed, hysterical, crying because I had a feeling and a glimpse into a life, a person I wanted to be, and I was afraid I was never going to live it. Okay? I mean this so sincerely, and the feeling was so overwhelming that I literally could feel this thing. But everything else in my life was telling me that I was compromising that and that I would never be able to do that. Just be an artist? Just be someone who is immersed in philosophy and thinking about all the big issues in the world? What a life. Rimbaud. Of course, he went to North Africa and was trading for the Dutch Trading Company or something like that, but whatever. That doesn't help the story. All right? That was the beginning of the deterioration of my marriage. That was the beginning of the deconstruction of the life that I was living. And that led to a separation and eventual divorce. So while I was in the middle of this separation, and at least 50% of us have been married at least once, or more than once in this room, so you know what that feels like, right? I'm going to have my big one-person exhibit, the second coming of Pablo Picasso. They're going to roll out the carpet, man. I got some shit to say in my artwork, and you're going to hear about it. And they gave me a show at the Steeple Street Gallery, Antonio de Toro's Steeple Street Gallery here in Providence. Antonio de Toro was a retired art teacher who had been in the Bataan Death March and was on the island when they dropped the bomb in Hiroshima and he was my mentor, and he was an amazing man, right? I did the show. This is my big coming out. Every day, opening the newspaper for a review. Even the assumption that I would get a review was ridiculous. I did. Let me read just a couple lines from that. I know this is a no-no. You're not supposed to read at these things. Sorry. Channing Gray, who's still a writer here in Providence today, artist social commentary. And I'm only going to read a couple lines from it. Using art as a vehicle for social commentary is a risky proposition at best, the kind of thing that if not handled well can turn into propaganda. Okay. And then down further it says, Crenca is someone who appears to be deeply concerned about the injustices of the world. In fact, there is hardly an issue or event he has escaped his attention. He's got it. He's got me. Until it gets to here. Unfortunately, his work, flat, postal-like canvases and abstract concoctions, we'll get that right, of urethane, dead leaves, and bones offers very little insight into these often tragic situations, nor for that matter does it unlock any of the emotions associated with them, and on and on. I was ruined. I had given up my entire life for this. It was the biggest kick in the stomach you can imagine. And Providence was desperate. This entire downtown was like a mini Detroit, okay, where Detroit is at now. It was a terrible, terrible place. And artists and musicians were trying to get out of here. Where were they going? They were trying to get to Boston. They were trying to get to New York, right? But they read this, and they read how severe it was, and they read that there was political nature. They all started to come to the show. One of them artists decides he's going to write an op-ed piece, doesn't agree with the reviewer, and I'll just read the end of his. The work of Umberto Crenca. Mr. Crenca's work, in particular the small drawings, evoke a sense of common link between those who participate in protest and those who suffer. They show who suffer, protest, and oppress, thereby pointing out to all of us the fragility of power, security, and life itself. I urge the public to view the show themselves and judge whether the shortcomings of Umberto Crenca's art are in the review. What happened? More artists came. We started meeting, we talked, we wrote a manifesto. Manifesto trashed everything in the art world as being elitist, classist, that its only intent was to support Western European traditions, and this is not really what art is about. That there's something much more intrinsically valuable about the artist and about artistic practice. Or as Mayakovsky said, the Russian poet, who died tragically young, but Mayakovsky said, the art is not a mirror to the world, but a hammer with which to shape it. That's the world I thought I was in. That was the fantasy I was having when I was on the left bank of the Seine, right? What the hell I do with that thing? That was my coming out party. RuPaul. Gotta love RuPaul. So all this happened. I went off back to Europe. I traveled for 3 months and went to all of these amazing places, southern France where Van Gogh lived, and talks about the wonderful sun, and did this and that. Actually did a one-person show in Italy. I visited places where my father was born. My father was an Italian immigrant, worked in factories his whole life. Then came back, and now what? So I decided that I was going to take all of these experiences that I had, and this idea that every person is born inquisitive and creative, this idea that there's some power in creating an opportunity for anybody and everybody to be able to nurture that within themselves, and that we can only be stronger as a community. And differences and bridging our differences can only come from this. I know this, right? So I come back. I have $800 in the bank. I put it down in Providence Performing Arts Center, actually, on the 3rd floor. It had just reopened. I sold them the idea that maybe a 60s kind of James Taylor coffee house, and I didn't mention the unjuried, uncensored part. So we had all-night raves, and we had hip-hop shows and heavy metal bands. And one night called the Final Incision that Brown and Rizzi students did with Roadkill on crosses and bands like Shithouse and Sleep Chamber. Place was completely packed. They were burning wormwood and incense, and they had a strobe light going. And the building was pulsating because, again, Providence was empty. you could hear coming from that building for 4 blocks. Coincidentally, they were having a board of directors meeting that night. So we got a beautiful letter from them in a couple of days. They said they thought what we were doing was very important, that we needed to find someplace else to do it. And we moved into an unheated building, and there's a whole lot of story. There's no electricity, no plumbing, and all that, and we got things going. Today, this is what AS220 looks like. These are 3 buildings that were completely or essentially unoccupied in horrific condition that we renovated. It's $25 million of investment in the city. You've passed these buildings. And some of the stuff that happens in these buildings in a course of 1 year. Still unjuried, uncensored. We have an equal pay policy for the staff. We're a $4 million project with 60 employees, and we're continuing to grow, and we have another building we're working on right now. And this is our vision statement. Now you trace all the way back. I should take that nun to dinner, right? Now you have to suffer through a very quick, cheeky little animation. And of course, thank you.